think we are in time, and we don't have that much time. So thank you everyone for coming. This is a special place. Normally we have these Innovate talks in Stubbins. Today we've been moving from Stubbins to Piper, from Piper to 1 to 4. We have today Andrew Holder. As you know, he's one of our new young faculty at the department, and he has been, he comes from LA. He has a practice that is LADG, that probably you know, and he basically has been teaching previously to come to the GSD in Michigan and other places that I don't remember now that are here. And USLE, SciArc, yeah, Queensland, exactly, and has received some prizes from the Architectural League in New York and other awards. And I think that more than reading the paper that probably you can read in the web, I would like to present him as someone that for us has been a surprise and an interesting surprise from the moment he came to present his work, because he's one of the few that is trying to bridge in innovative ways these two areas that we are always saying that we want to bridge and that are so difficult to bridge, technology and history and culture, I would say, and he's doing it with such a surprising body of work that in a way is bringing at least a kind of disruptive way to think and a kind of something that is allow us to breathe a better oxygen. I have to say that the title is Bricks Like You, and I didn't have time to ask him exactly about what it is, but I don't care. I don't care. I mean, whatever he would say, it would be really difficult to say what is it exactly about. And it's one of the most difficult things to do nowadays, to surprise and to be able to bring things that deal with historical issues in ways that are unpredictable. So with this very short presentation, let's join. Welcome in, Andrew. Thank you. Surprise us.
I will. Thank you so much, Iñaki. And let me say thanks for the invitation to speak at such a kind of early date in my tenure at the GSD. There we go. It's in position. I think what that means is that Iñaki has no idea what I'm about to talk about, so it's sort of in the spirit of a surprise. A couple of days ago, Iñaki charged me with a kind of request, which is that he wanted me to offer critical commentary on the discussion that has taken place this term around the theme of organization, which I took as a kind of invitation to commit a public act of suicide by critiquing my colleagues and the work that has been done so far, but I'll happily accept that invitation. And I'll do it by way of offering a few reminders or just suggestions that we remember a few things that have perhaps received lesser emphasis in this term's discussion of the theme organization. So reminder the first, geometry is not equivalent to order. However much we might want geometric principles to pass over into the realms of material and politics, they can only do so if, in Colin Rowe's words, they, quote, bear the scars of the ordeal. If geometry wants to be order, it is probable that we will no longer be able to appreciate it for its antiseptic clarity. The second reminder, the subject is under construction. So I would ask, who are we trying to organize? We occasionally lapse into a description of a fixed and immutable human subject and forget that this person, whoever it might be, is always changing and is no doubt always reconstructed by the projects we propose, which is to say architecture constructs its own subject, so let's be explicit about who and what this might be. The third reminder and final reminder, if given a choice between body and soul, choose body. So not just at the GSD, but in architecture at large and the kind of contemporary conversation, I think there is a great deal of conversation about what is good for architecture or what good architecture might be able to do in the world, how we should correct and reform its inner impulses. And I would characterize that as our discipline waging a contest to reform the soul of architecture. but we might be better served by choosing the body of architecture, its external aspects and relationships, particularly how it looks and how those looks function in the world. So those are my 3 reminders, and I think they'll be sort of more or less explicit in the work I'm about to show. And in terms of the work I'm about to show, I'll just confess at the outset, I'm only showing 2 projects. One I'll speak about sort of at great length for about 15 minutes or so, the other very briefly at the end. None of what you're about to see, I think, qualifies easily as architecture. We might call these the kind of weird or investigational projects in my office. So as you might know, this lecture series is called Innovate. I'm very uncomfortable with the kind of claim of novelty that term might apply to my work. I prefer instead a sort of strict rereading or a strict reading of the term Innovate, which is more about a reworking of something old. And that's what I intend to do. So I'm going to show this project 48 characters, just describe it in very banal terms, what are you seeing, and then describe at more length sort of 3 lines of discourse that have emerged as I have read and reread this project post facto, and perhaps explain a bit how those lines of discourse have informed my thinking about the possibilities for work going forward, particularly the project at the end. So this is 48 characters. It was a project at the University of Michigan, begun in 2012, concluded in 2013. So this is the gallery at the University of Michigan. My installation was about a third of it. It consists of 4 of these very large pedestals, the tallest of which is almost 7 feet. The rest are roughly the size of a human body. And they all come with a sort of crust of these plaster animals, which I termed balloon animals. Watch me on that term. I'm a little slippery. Occasionally I will call them characters or something else. These pedestals function in the round. They have a kind of 3-dimensional aspect. Some of them are hanging in sacks from the wall in kind of distensions. And I would like to emphasize that there were both high and low techniques of manufacture. So the pedestals were created using CNC-aided machinery and robots and all of that kind of stuff. But the focus of the installation was on these balloon animals and their very primitive method of manufacture. So here I am using a grout bag, which is a kind of tool of a mason, to inject plaster into just a standard latex party balloon. These are the implements used to shape those balloons. They're mostly just household objects, a few things from a fishing tackle box. And these are the results prior to the application of paint. And so there are some common characteristics here. First, in terms of their identification, they are vaguely animal, but not known nameable animals. I would also say that they are unitary in that they possess features, but not known nameable features. And although these features are countable in number, so I might say 1 distension, 2 distensions, and 1 belly, 1, 2, 3, it's not as though we can easily extricate them from the body. So there are these seams or lines of incision, but they're not an obvious place at which you could sort of decouple one part from another. So let's say end description of the installation. Let's begin then these sort of 3 lines of discourse that emerge from it. And as I've said, I've retroactively reread little tiny pieces of this thing over and over again to think about ways in which it might inform future work and, in a sort of strict sense, innovate. So the first line of discourse, I would say, is from brick to character or snuggle fits. And perhaps here by the end of this section, the title Bricks Like You will begin to make a bit more sense. I might subtitle this discourse, Geometry is not necessarily equivalent to order, as a reference back to my first reminder. So let's just take a look very quickly at just a smattering of episodes in the development of bricks. I don't claim these as a kind of complete history, but they're, let's say, moments of interest, beginning in the upper left with H.H. Richardson's Marshall Fields Wholesale Building, commissioned in 1885. Their rusticated masonry hides the seams that sort of disguise the repetition of these self-similar bricks that sort of stack to form a wall. In the lower right-hand corner, that's Aranda Losh's PS1 competition entry from 2009, I believe. It's entitled Grotto, which I think of as taking up H.H. Richardson's project to disguise the seam. Here, though, the project is very different in that the seam disguising strategy applies to the composition of the brick itself. So they have these apparently irregular polyhedra that they call boulders, but disguised within there is still a kind of face-to-face match. Triangle meets triangle, Geometry authorizes the kind of order of one brick next to another. Greg Lynn's blob wall is the next in the series, where he has chosen to bend that geometry into three-dimensional space. Regardless of the bend, there is still an identifiable fitting part where one face rests atop another. And then finally, I would say the kind of conceptual limit condition of bricks in this lineage would be Moss's rainbow vomit installation on the upper right. Still concerned with the geometry of matching faces, but here in a negative sense. So bricks are allowed to rest on point or rotated with respect to one another. The general rule seems to be never match an identical face with an identical face. So I step back and ask, what do all these have in common? Well, two things. Geometry is intimately involved in the project of laying one thing against another. And geometry authorizes what can become of the stack, whether it becomes a cave, a wall, a pile, or so on. And I am interested in how we sort of escape this dialogue of that so intimately relates geometry and the brick. And I would say we do it like this, by offloading the work of geometry to character. So what you are seeing here is not a fit between bricks, but a snuggle fit, or what I would call a flat relation of two things hugging one another. There are no fitting parts per se, just as there are no fitting parts in, let's say, two clasped hands. There are just surfaces that press against one another, and the hands retain their identity on both sides of that equation. Instead, we could talk about fitting motives or fitting desires. So the piglet pokes, the piglet finds a crevice, the piglet snuggles. So hierarchy here is different than hierarchy in bricks, which is why I call it a flat relation. So balloon animals may clamber atop one another, but this kind of hierarchy always occurs on the same plane of interaction. There is no particularly privileged balloon animal as, let's say, the keystone in an arch. So the second line of discourse has to do with inanimate subjecthood, basically producing the effects of life from inert matter. So if this discourse about snuggle fit between bricks offers an alternate theory of aggregation, I think it also shifts the focus from the bricks in aggregate to the character as a singular entity and an investigation of what that character can do. And I'm interested in sort of stretching that capacity to the maximum extent sort of allowed by credibility, or even perhaps a bit beyond that point. So this investigation led me to a 1968 essay by Michael Fried, of course, extremely well known, Art and Objecthood. And in this essay, Fried is concerned with artworks like this one. This is Frank Stella's Effingham 1 of 1966. And you can see it's a very short distance from this painting to dispensing with pictorial illusion altogether and just hanging a thing on a wall or placing a thing on a gallery, which is what terrified Fried. And in fact, Tony Smith had done this 4 years prior with his work Die in 1962. So Michael Fried levels a kind of extreme critique against this object, and I would just like to read you a few of his observations because I find them to be fascinating. So Fried says, and I quote, "The beholder knows himself to stand in an indeterminate, open-ended, and unexacting relationship as subject to the impassive object on wall or floor. In fact, being distanced by such objects is not, I suggest, entirely unlike being distanced or crowded by the silent presence of another person." Quote Fried again, "Inasmuch as the literalist's work depends on the beholder, it is incomplete without him. It has been waiting for him. And once he is in the room, the work refuses obstinately to let him alone, which is to say, it refuses to stop confronting him." So I found this to be fascinating. I think it's a kind of crazy commentary. It's that Fried anthropomorphizing his own fear in a sense. But I also think it's a kind of marvelously sensitive reading of what objects might do in extremis, create the life effects of another person. Freud's concern with this is that creating the life effects of another person is theatrical. In other words, in my reading, there is a kind of inauthentic relationship between a person and a cube. This is a cube attempting to be a person, and the inauthenticity of that relationship troubles Freud. It troubles me as well. But I think that's good news because it's a problem that we can solve and claim all of Freud's critique actually as a potential power for architecture. We can use inanimate material to generate these kinds of life effects. So the question for me is, are there things which do not have that kind of inauthentic relationship between what they appear to be and the kinds of effects that they project? We might consider a spectrum from, let's say, platonic solids to a series of embryos drawn after Ernst Haeckel. We could think of this as a kind of gradient of formal articulation. So if platonic solids are always exactly inauthentic in the sense that a sphere is always an imperfect representation of some ideal that's hovering out there in the world, we could also think of the embryos as not being quite things in themselves. They are incipient or imminent chickens in this case. They're on their way to being something else. But perhaps in the middle between these two poles of formal articulation, there is another series of objects which do not stand in for anything else but rest as themselves and can claim a set of effects that are kind of concomitant with their form and materiality. So we want to test these things. So our studio would take objects like this, some of the balloon animals, and we would identify one of its features and test it on the semiotic square. So here I'm kind of perversely misusing the semiotic square. It's meant to open up the kind of imaginative space between a set of related terms. I'm using it in the opposite way, like radar, to locate the position of something. And we would ask, is this a finger or a nose? Is it not a finger, not a nose? And we are interested in the extent to which this feature continually refuses these kinds of associations. It has a kind of negative trajectory across the semiotic square. What we want it to do is be its own thing and reside in this kind of space of being slightly unnameable. So affiliative but unnameable. The goal, I think, is something like this. So perhaps I can convince you that this is not a picture of an object being observed by many subjects. It's a picture of an audience plus one. So a crowd of subjects, one of whom is enjoying a moment of popular attention. And this is a first move toward a world of total audience, which I would say is where we would like to go. So bricks, in that sense, they are like you. So the third rereading of this project we'll call The Politics of Flat Relations. So I would just like to remind you that we're sort of interested in this world where appearances matter, and so maybe for a moment we can consider a political test case of the opposite. This drawing by Choisy from the 1873 treatise on Roman architecture. So you see here in a worm's eye, I believe this is a worm's eye plan oblique view. So he's looking sort of impossibly from underneath and inscribing this series of diagrammatic lines on the underside of these columns, and these lines are meant to indicate structural forces, ideal brick sizes and types that might be used to achieve these forms, and for him even much more. Ideal labor and economic conditions that would be associated with the construction of something like this, and even the possible sort of rise and fall of the state. So I would ask, what is he drawing here? He's drawing the animating force or the cause of the form, and also the lines that regulate its correct behavior. So that is a drawing of the soul. And to me, this is somewhat troubling. First, because there is a mistrust, or at least a trivialization of the world of appearances built into this image. So for me, everything that a real person would be able to see on the exterior, all of this sort of rough masonry, is associated with the kind of low-status entourage of the drawing. It's way up here, it's kind of with the whimsical trees and clouds. What he's interested in is this stuff here, that only Choisy has sort of intellectual access to. He becomes the arbiter of what is correct, and I think that shift in power relationships is a little bit bothersome. So sort of in its most extreme instantiation, we could associate Choisy's drawing with Foucault's reading of the Panopticon. Choisy has drawn the lines along which surveillance can take place. Those lines are internalized by the subject. They're inside the building. We can measure deviations from desirable behavior. And I think it's no accident that in both drawings, the important stuff is the stuff on the inside, and there is a kind of minimal value allocated to external appearance. So if Choisy proposes one image of the conceptual genesis of a building, so here's another. Here's three of us wrangling a balloon animal into life. This is a contest of bodies. We exercise incomplete control over willful materiality, so these balloons tend to explode. When you press them in one direction, they expand in the opposite. And in fact, the tools were designed to kind of poke, prod, and wrangle the balloon into position, but never perfectly register their negative on the surface here. So we're always interested in designing a tool that registers its contest with the body of the balloon, but not its dominance of that. Or let's say not its conceptual negative or impression. So if we want to be, so here's a catalog of tools that do that, things that are sort of sized and have specific radii that permit that contest between bodies to occur. And you have things like wooden spoons and fishing line, and lots of basswood. So if we want to complete the kind of Foucaultian parallel, here's Warbeck in the stocks. This is a sort of pre-modern form of the exercise of power that has nothing to do with the soul and everything to do with the body. And if the king wants to win in this image, he can only do so by a sort of overwhelming projection of force on the plane of body versus body. And I would say, if given a choice between these two kinds of gazes, the one that projects a certain kind of correctness in the one sense, the other that offers the viewer a place on a sort of level playing field, I would choose the body over the soul. So those are the three lines of discourse that emerge from that project. And now just briefly, before we open this up to discussion, I wanted to talk about a particular project that emerged from this line of thinking. So this past summer, we showed at Jai & Jai Gallery in Los Angeles this project called Houses and the Figures That Go in Them. So here is an example of one of the houses. They are all made of plaster cloth, which is this material that behaves like fabric when it's dry, but as soon as you wet it, it sort of hardens into a stiff mat. All of these were drawn, and you can see the figures that go in them here at a very small scale. And then here is one of these figures in a kind of macro photograph. So here, this is, well, let's linger here for just one moment. I think if we're capable of flattening the relationship between people and architecture, it is also possible to imagine that people can be designed just like buildings. And I think this can be reframed in language that is a bit more palatable to the academy, which would be, if every work of architecture constructs its own subject intellectually, we can then, following Vitruvius, Corbusier, and many others, literalize that subject in drawings and models. So we can make our own people. So that's what we were trying to do here. And we are interested in the kind of contemporary definition of personhood, particularly as people are seen by machine vision. So maybe some of you know of this project. It's called Google's Deep Dream. You can upload any image to Deep Dream, and it will use face recognition algorithms to find figures in that image that may or may not actually be there. And it will recursively apply that algorithm so that it amplifies the appearance of things it believes it is seeing. So this is fascinating to us because first it produces these kind of surreal eyeballs in dogs playing poker. This is what Deep Dream believes it sees there. But also because there is a kind of politics here. If facial recognition software is helping define who is who and even who is human, then perhaps we should sort of take its output at face value and construct the people that facial recognition software sees. So we began with just random images like this. So this is some potato salad. Applied our own series of algorithms to find figures like this, which we then through this sort of complex digital process sort of spatialized into these kind of quasi-figures that have things we can recognize as faces and limbs, and then a series of drawings where we're interested in putting the figure back into dialogue with the sort of glitched up photograph from which it is drawn, or sort of in which it was incorrectly recognized at first. So we have some that are sort of hairy in aspect, others that are sort of patchy in aspect. And again, there's always this sense of a figure sort of staring out at you from a misfit or malformed body of material. So those were the figures. Let's talk about the houses that they go in. Here, we're interested in the kind of loose fit between bricks, which is a sort of, so if we rewind to 48 characters, we got a lot of airspace between these adjacent objects. And that's a liability at a small scale. So how do you keep the rain out? How do you keep mice out? But perhaps those liabilities are not quite as extreme at a large scale if there are much bigger things that sort of retain their unitary objecthood, but we stack them up one against another. And this struck us as a kind of very interesting possibility in terms of thinking through the spatial types that result, and also examining the kinds of properties of that space. So we get a kind of leakiness. So things are always kind of flowing freely in section. It's difficult to tell where the outside sort of forms an inclusion into the interior. And there's always a sort of implication of the ground, as in you need something else to set these on. So in our case, we kind of literalized that relationship as a coffee table and gave it some desk lamps that you can see there. We would admire these kinds of aggregations for being open and extensible without being repetitive. You can sort of add anything to them. They're resilient in that sense. And we also admire them for their effect of sort of domestic scaling. So regardless of the scale at which they are drawn or the kind of representational scale, they retain a degree of smallness or, let's say, domesticity, irrespective of that representational scale. So I'd like to close here with this image of the interior of one of the house models built for our exhibition. And so obviously what interests me about this model is that it forms an interior without hollowness, and the space occupied by figures is this residual negative left over by solids that have been accumulated. And I would hope that this discussion of organization that we're having can be elastic enough to accommodate a picture like this, where there is no abstract animating principle that can be held to account for the world of appearances. Instead, we can think of the visible realm as the place where cause resides, where the disposition of one thing against another gives rise to order or to perhaps multiple orders. And let me be clear here that by using this term, the visible, I would count history, I would count aesthetics, critical theory, the human sciences, as among the fields of study engaged with this project of discerning the effects that radiate outward from things. So in short, there exists what I would call a physics of appearance, the study of which we can no longer displace from the academy on the grounds that it constitutes bad behavior or a low form of intellection. Thank you.
I think that I have to sit with you, Inanimate.
Oh, yeah, please.
Thank you so much. The format, as many of you know, and those that don't know will know now, is very informal. Basically, we have a conversation after the presentation, and we have invited Mariana, who is the organizer and the curator of the Organization or Design Symposium, and Erika, and myself, basically, to begin a short discussion. And then it's open to all of you, and we close in let's say, another 20, 30 minutes as a maximum, okay? this is it. And maybe Colin also, who is here looking to me, can participate. I would like to begin with just posing the question that was implicit to the title of the symposium itself, no? The idea of or the organization or design as a question mark. I mean, when I see your projects and your references and intellectual references, I think that in a way, if I'm going to respond freely as if I were you, and you then contest me.
Oh,
okay?
I like this. Yeah.
Okay, right.
Good, okay.
If the question is organization or design, I think that it would be difficult for you, but probably you choose more design than organization. But if the question would be exactly the opposite, this design or disorganization, bet that you would like more disorganization than the other terms. So I think that in a way, it's a kind of joke, but I think that in a way the work is about an investigation among the limits of the ideal use of organizational tools and the subjectivity that is present in many other practices that have to deal with volume, surface, visual, textures, etc., etc. No, in a sense, I think that you have used a vocabulary that touches, not directly, but almost tangentially, some of the topics that the picturesque aesthetic has brought into discussion from long time ago, and that seems to me that in plastic arts and somehow in architecture is coming back, moments of coming back. So you talk about pictorial, visual, surface, body, smallness. In a way, intricacy is what is in this slide. Words that became aesthetic categories at the end of the 18th century. No? Well, can you elaborate on this?
Sure. So I appreciate your sort of characterization of my fictional response, right up to the point where you say that I would prefer disorganization over design. So for me, it's more a question of where are we looking for organization? Are we looking for geometric evidence of it in the kind of physical array of objects? Or are we looking for organization in the effects that those objects produce? So I think in this case, or in that sort of line of thinking, the picturesque is an excellent test case. So there have been various moments at which the picturesque has sort of experienced a resurgence, and then various moments at which it is sort of beaten back. Normally the academy sort of leads the charge that beats it back. And when it is dismissed and beaten back, it is almost always on the grounds of its haphazardness and apparent disorder. But in fact, what I believe the picturesque was trying to achieve is a kind of ordering in another medium, which is on the surface of a picture plane, and trying to dispose or render reality, like arrange real stuff, so that it generates the properties of viewing a picture. And that's a very low-level comment, but I think there are some kind of radical reorganizations of buildings and landscapes. So, for instance, you could detect something like a foreground, a middle ground, and a background, but it's those pictorial orders that we would find, and I would call that the kind of organization. And we would need a certain amount of resistance to totalizing geometric order in the disposition of those physical things in order to achieve that other kind of organization. So absolutely interested in organization, just maybe looking for it in a different place.
Okay.
Well, I guess I'll jump in.
Can you?
Do I need this? I guess I need this. I apologize. I've just come from a lecture and my head is kind of swimming, and now it's swimming even more. But this is a delight. And it's a delight because I'm going to respond not as I think you, not putting myself in your place, but sort of relishing in the kind of elegant and brief allusions you made to history, but a lot of them seem to circulate around my favorite sort of non-period, which is Rokai or Rococo. And the reason I say this is that, you know, your sort of characters, your figurations that posit affect in the early 18th century is really a moment when you see the sort of ideology of the individual, a new kind of subjectivity emerge, and also along with it, the possibility that parts of the body that are related to particular senses emerge as form generators. And not only bodies, but body parts, the ear, the eye, the touch, the hand. And often that the Rokai is this kind of, is viewed, and it's part of the reason it was rejected in the second half of the 18th century as, you know, a kind of pile. The French word is amas, a pile, an inchoate pile, is precisely because it was so affect loaded that it disorientated, that's the word, that's disorientate, the viewer who presumably is being swallowed alive in this total sort of manufactured chaos of preciousness that in fact is taking not simply inanimate matter, but matter that can become shells that give life. You know, it's this liminal zone where the inanimate becomes animate. And I can't think of another period really that did that so well. And it's why I think, you know, it was a joy to hear you go back to Freud. I haven't heard discussion of Freud in a long time. It took me back to my doctoral days. I worked personally with Tim Clark. They were good friends. And of course, you know, that essay actually was, as much as it was embedded in thinking about abstraction, it came to frame his entire book on the Enlightenment, absorption and theatricality. And his sense was, and you know, philosophers have talked about this, but the sense that this is really the beginning of the modern period, this turn not away from the maker to the beholder. And for Freud, it went in two directions. It went in terms of the object could absorb you, absorption, so that it would actually instill in the viewer a kind of paralytic contemplative state on the one hand, or on the other hand, it's theatricality. And here you can look at the most tacky Greuze paintings in the world and think of the sort of absurd, hysterical theatricality and gesticulation of form. And it's fascinating that he needed those two to sort of be a binary for explicating, if you will, the state of the viewer of affect. Which brings me to your title, and this is only because I just lectured on Foucault and on Louis XIV of all things, but your title is hilarious, and I don't know if you meant this. There are two ways you could read it, right? Right. Bricks Like You is a realm of what Foucault calls the realm of similitudes, right? Which is actually not a modern realm at all. It is the world of the Renaissance. The world of a tripartite system of sign making where there is a signifier, a signified, and you need a conjunction, the realm of the like, the simile, to bring them together. So Bricks Like You seems to really take us back to a different kind of time. But also Bricks Like You. They want to be around you. They want to poke you. They want to love you, right? So I'm wondering about those two very different interpretations, which have hugely different kinds of semantic outcomes, and which I wasn't so sure I was clear about, because actually the line of your argument, which started with ekphrasis and took us down 3 lines of discourses that were actually linked and that became rather than were, right? They weren't 3 discourses, but it was like moving from being to becoming, was really about the second part, how they like you. Do you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, so fantastic, and just a huge amount to chew on. So let me just sort of start with my amateur's reading of Foucault. A lot of this speculation kind of comes out of a particular attitude toward the order of things, and a sympathy for the first third, and the kind of logic of similitude, the system of signs, and the kinds of behaviors that would authorize with respect to things. And I think you can, as an active reader, look at sort of the last third of Foucault, of that book, and detect a nostalgia for the beginning, that he's actually looking forward to the end of the modern period, and it might send us back to a kind of system of likenesses. At least I think that possibility is intimated. And so it seems as though if we were at that point again, or if perhaps we are headed forward to that point, that this is not nostalgic at all, there are a whole series of powers that we can claim in objects. So yes, they are like us, and that kind of elimination of the membrane between us and them carries a kind of exciting set of possibilities. And perhaps this is a bit too glib, but yes, maybe one of those first possibilities is a kind of a crude animism, and they might like you back. Yeah, I think you're right to identify a kind of conceptual cleavage between those two readings. I think that would be the way I would try to sort of suture them back together. And then in terms of the Rococo and theatricality, so the faculty know this. I've kind of disclosed it in a meeting where I was asked to very briefly present my own work. I have a sort of sympathy for the late Rococo, particularly as it was taken up in Bavaria, which was kind of the apotheosis and the end of the Rococo. Like, it didn't go much further beyond Germany. And as I look back at that work, two things worry me a lot. The first is you go to the interior of one of these churches, there are nameable things everywhere, nameable plants, shells, people who have names. There is stuff you should know, and those allusions get incredibly specific, like a nude woman holding holewort or some strange plant means chastity or virtue. And it's a system of signs that is entirely opaque to us. Like, this language and this circulation of signs, it doesn't mean anything anymore. And I think a problem with returning to the Rococo is there is no similarly legible substitute system. There's no story that I could tell this room that would be equally legible to all of us educated people. So we can't use things with names anymore. We have to invent things that appeal in a different way, which gets to my kind of like picking a fight with Platonic solids. How can they sort of be massaged out of that ideal state? Is there something in that massaging that retains a degree of appeal and familiarity even as they deform? And I'm working toward that kind of alternate system of appeal that doesn't mean that we all have to have read the Bible. I guess that's what it gets down to in the end. Yeah.
Yes, I'm here, embedded in the audience, like in that photo of the piñata.
Yeah.
First I want to say that I cannot possibly do what Erica just did so elegantly. So excuse me, my response or attempt to frame a question is going to be a little bit more haphazard. One, I love the presentation. I love the ideas that come out of the presentation, and I love the way that you're arguing through the projects for those ideas. One thing that seemed to be very consistent and apparent was that if we're focusing on the issue of organization, all the ideas were dependent on the organization of matter. One of the things that perhaps we were trying to do with the topic of organization is try to associated with different things where matter or material is one amongst many possibilities. The second thing would be that you spoke multiple times about the definition of a subject. I don't think that necessarily means or says anything about the definition of its subjectivity. But I think in the way you presented, somehow conditions of that subjectivity are embedded within its own definition of subject and as well to its definition of matter. So I think that's a very particular way of doing it. You could have define conditions of subject without necessarily at all giving away conditions of subjectivity. And then the last comment, perhaps also related to Iñaki's first provocation, is that at least in coming from me, the title of the event of the question was not a prompt to having to choose one over the other, but in the sense of occupying the question to give somehow kind of that the possibility of kind of a lateral reading through which we can use both organization and design, neither as opposites, neither as complementary, but as of different forms that might expand on one another. So in this case, perhaps the question is how the work would be transformed if we had to either argue it through its condition of design, through its condition of organization, or through the condition that the question proposes.
Yeah, those are great. So let me sort of take the last one and the first one before we think about subjects again. So design or organization, my fear is that the default mode in architecture is that organization precedes design. So we start with a grid, we make a building. And I think it is very difficult to find cases where that is not true. So the opposite is, I would say, a kind of marginalized position. Perhaps that's arguable. And so sort of being a serial champion of underdogs, I just want to invert the proposition and think about design. What could possibly motivate it in the absence of an a priori organization? And after you figure out those motives, then what do you do with it, and like how does it organize stuff in space? So I think that's related to your first question about the organization of matter, which is a similar, I mean, I think it could have been called matter or organization as well, because we always think of like the grid is imposed on the plywood, and the grid precedes your use of plywood. And so I think I'm maybe nostalgic for a moment in, let's say, like 2003 or 2004, when people were taking up the question of what happens if you begin with matter. And I think a lot of the investigations at that moment were super problematic, and they didn't get us much closer to buildings. But that's an interesting question. And then about the kind of subject and subjectivity, I'm glad that you brought that up again, because I sort of avoided that question or that implication of what Erica had mentioned, which has to do with the kind of sensuous and the affective. I'm a little bit nervous about a particular kind of architecture that is all about sensual engagement to the point where we're licking the walls and rolling on fur rugs. And I know that's not a kind of common strain of project here, but rest assured in other parts of the world that is a common strain of project, or at least one that appears from time to time. And it's the kind of passivity of humans just sort of like rolling around enjoying themselves that worries me. And so I am trying to, let's say, take up other aspects of being a subject and like admit cognition into the equation. We're not just lolling on the fur rug, we're thinking about it. You know, a polar bear rug, what kind of bear rug? Yeah.
Can I add one question and then I open? It's about the status of your work, no? Which is very difficult to really create a kind of place for it in a kind of given taxonomy. And I think that there are a lot of influences and a kind of close relationship with some artistic practices, especially in LA. I don't know if you have been involved in this, but there's a Paul McCartney, not the musician, but the artist, and Kippenberger, when he was living in LA, and all these German let's say expressionists, neo-expressionists of the 80s, 90s, that in a way were also discussing the objecthood of painting and trying to establish a kind of other kind of, I wouldn't say installations, but narratives more than installations. And I think that in your case there is a kind of impact of this kind of practices in the status of your work, but I don't know, I really don't know. I would like you to elaborate a little bit on this, and then we open.
Yeah. So clearly, my intellectual training began in Los Angeles, and I'm working through a kind of prolonged hangover about what it means to move eastward. So yes, all of those practices are, yeah, all of like there are lingering associations with a lot of artistic practices and architectural practices in LA. I think maybe what I would sort of choose to hear in the question is a kind of cruder or simpler form, which is just like, Andrew, choose art or architecture. Like, where does this belong? And the reason I would choose a kind of cruder form of that question is that I think it goes to the viability of a practice and what you can sell. So the difference between me and an artist is I've never sold a drawing or a model, nor would anyone take it seriously if sort of exhibited in venues that privilege that kind of work. Like, this is bad art. If you've seen the good stuff, the Paul McCartney stuff, that's good. This is quite bad. And I say that it is bad because it's up to something different. We are trying to find ways to pursue this line of thinking, but always make a little thing that we can zoom into as a representational device and try to ask the question, how does this inform building? How could this, no matter how absurd, how could this be a building? What is the association of parts that could sort of stack its way into a thing if we're interested in kind of returning to simple trabeation? So yeah, I would say our practice is in a rush to figure out that problem of translation into building. I practiced for 10 years after grad school before seriously returning to the academy, and so I've had that experience of sort of being a service firm, and I'm sort of horrified by it, and now trying to let's say, like, expand the territory and re-inject some of these ideas sort of back into a plausible sort of architectural realm. Yeah.
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 This is what I was trying to hear. I mean,
Yeah.
Okay, I have a quick question. So one of the themes that has returned throughout the sort of treatment of organization is, but hasn't really been talked to explicitly so much, is life. And you actually dwelt a lot on this. I'm wondering, what kind of life are you thinking about? I mean, it's very clear that this is sort of somewhere between, like you suggested, animism and also illusion, but it's not clear where. So I'm just wondering, how would you define life? And the other question is, that's a very general question, but also it seems like these things are either living, but they're not really living. So they're behaving in a certain way. So if you had to distinguish between life and behavior, how would you do that? Would you?
I guess I want a life where, let's say, irrational behavior is more kind of rigorously grounded. That's the kind of life I'm after. So if I had to pick a person who's writing about the form of life that is possibly an outcome of this kind of work, I might point to Rancière and aesthetics and its discontents and say a kind of free play with respect to architecture is much more interesting to me than a kind of top-down disciplining. So what do I want that to feel like? It might be more about the sensation of first arrival on Easter Island, where there's a kind of clear motive behind the construction of mysterious objects that have a sort of open-ended relationship to inhabitation. You don't know what you're supposed to do, but you can do a lot of different things. Yeah.
Another, yeah, please.
We need a mic right here. Okay. I'm curious about the small sort of tumescent figures, because at the sort of horizon of movements that privilege certain types of rigorous, productive techniques, like say modernism, you find Gorky and you find Mata, and you start to see these little sort of figures that seem like they're inflated from the inside rather than sculpted from the outside. You see Senga, right? LA. Again, very, very similar sorts of figures. And so the question that I ask is, and this isn't an attempt to be polemical, I'm just asking what's different about this? I know that the technique is different. The productive side of it is different. But the reason why I ask that is because we've also seen examples of people like Guarini, for instance, or Borromini, who used, say, rigorous sort of geometric transformative techniques to produce forms that seem extremely biomorphic and almost seem to erase or elide their methods of production. And so I suppose I'm a little confused about the binary, I should say. And I'm curious about what's different about these sorts of figures and sort of whatever sort of follows from that sort of difference.
Yeah, so I read the question as like, what's new? And the answer in a certain formal strain is not much. So I think you can certainly go back to surrealism and find a lot of people who are investigating a very similar category of form making. I think where this becomes interesting is in sort of two regions. The first is purely argumentative, that I'm being explicit about, and maybe this is not so different than certain surrealist practices, but I'm being explicit about wanting to find a category of form that is at once familiar and unfamiliar, universal but unknown. The second is that I am interested in literalism. So this is not the kind of invention of a fictional body. I am working my way up toward literal things that I mean to sort of replicate at full scale in the world, and we're kind of working on that. Let's say with our project for an oyster bar in Los Angeles that's at Grand Central Market. But it's what's new, it's in the effects, and it's the degree to which we're willing to take these things seriously as actual. Where I think as in the past, they've been couched in sort of fantasy, theater, a kind of projection of something that is beyond the realm of the possible.
Good. Let's go for, I mean, I want to keep it in short time. I mean, let's go for one last question, if any. 3, 2, 1, 0. Thank you so much.
Great. Yeah.
Very, very.